Hey everybody, Johnny the Queer POTUS here, and today I've decided to take on Candace Owens and her recent video entitled, I Do Not Support George Floyd. In this video, Candace Owens argues that the Black Lives Matter movement is wrong to make George Floyd a hero because he was actually a bad guy. Candace Owens spends a lot of the video going into stark detail about George Floyd's criminal record, and I am not going to argue with anything she found. As far as I can tell, those details about him are true. He did point a gun at a pregnant woman during an armed robbery in 1998 and served 5 years in jail. What I am going to argue against, however, is Candace Owens' larger point that racialized policing is a myth, and I'm going to try to expose what I perceive to be the deceptive way she and some notable others make this argument. I have left a link to Candace's full video in the description below, so you can watch what she says and determine whether I'm taking her out of context. I've also included some links to other Black creators who have responded to Candace's video, which I highly recommend you check out. Lastly, I just want to say that all the money from this video and my Patreon donations for the month will be going to Black Lives Matter. Okay, so let's get into this.
I want to come out and say that I do not support George Floyd and the media depiction of him as a martyr for Black America. I'm going to explain why, and I hope that some of you guys will understand where I'm coming from. I have spent a considerable amount of time reading a lot of Black authors that I think are some of the most brilliant Black Americans breathing. Walter Williams, Shelby Steele, Thomas Sowell, and I recently came across something that was an idea that was planted into my head by Shelby Steele, and it has been something that I cannot forget. It is something that will stick with me for the rest of my life. And it is something that I hope for the Black Americans that are watching will stick with you for the rest of your life. Shelby Steele said that the Black community is unique from other communities. Our culture is unique from other communities because we are the only community that caters to the bottom denominator of our society. Now, let me explain what that means.
Let's pause here for a moment. And don't worry, we will give Candace a chance to explain what she means. But let's try to drill down on that first claim, that the Black community is different from all other communities in that it caters to the bottom denominator. Now, I feel like the idea of catering to the bottom denominator is something I've actually heard praised in some old book somewhere. Can't quite remember which one.
I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me.
Interesting. It seems like Jesus, blessed are the poor Christ, is pretty on board with catering to the bottom denominator. In fact, it sounds like if our society was more like what Candace says the Black community is like, we'd live in a much better world. At least according to Jesus. But Shelby Steele, the author Candace quotes, begs to differ. Steele believes that the tendency to cater to the bottom denominator is endemic of a larger problem in the mentality of the Black community.
Explain that. Well, if you have been an oppressed people, and we were obviously truly oppressed for centuries, we learned all sorts of things in order to survive that. I won't go into a long list, but we learned how to reinvent ourselves. We learned how to live with this oppression, with this sort of negative force in your life. We were, I think, miraculous. We created a great music out of this. We did other things that had a worldwide impact. We expanded the idea of democracy and made freedom an absolute. We did all those things. The one thing we never had a chance to do was to live in freedom. We were never free. And the fact that beginning in the 60s when we began to confront freedom, when America backed up and said, okay, discrimination is wrong, there are a bunch of laws to support that, we're confronted. Well, what do you do with freedom? What are you going to do now?
Understanding the problem with Shelby Steele's answer here requires you to really listen to what he is asserting. Yes, he says, African Americans have lived with discrimination, but all that was before the Civil Rights Acts, when the U.S. government finally recognized that racial discrimination was wrong. The Civil Rights Act was year zero for black freedom, and any allusions to racism after that point are void. Well, the trouble is, the Civil Rights Act was a set of laws aimed at ending racial discrimination. They were not a magic potion which destroyed racism overnight. Just like the 13th Amendment did not end slavery the day it was ratified, nor did the 14th Amendment, which outlawed racial discrimination, end racism. So did the Civil Rights Act of 1965 still leave a lot of work to be done. In the statement we just heard from Shelby Steele, he manages to transform the Civil Rights Act, an act whereby the federal government recognized a responsibility to protect the black community from discrimination, into a Racism is Over Act, whereby the federal government shirked all responsibility to protect black people from discrimination. A law which was originally meant to signal, "We got your back," becomes a law which signals, "You're on your own now." So what is at the heart of this contradiction for Shelby Steele? The fact that black people were given freedom in 1965, but aren't being responsible with it.
Who says that's because of racism? Maybe it's because you haven't yet developed the value system to the ideas with which to thrive in freedom. Maybe you don't know what to do with the opportunities that surround you. It's understandable. You were oppressed. And people have not pointed out to you the challenge of freedom. And what do people do with freedom when they don't know how to handle it? They reinvent their oppression, even as it has faded away. All they can think to do is ask for more from the government. Well, we've asked for the government has given us almost everything. Nowhere in history has the government paid off its people more than America has in the last 60 years. And yet we are, by most socioeconomic measures, farther behind white America than we were in the 50s, when we had none of these social programs and so forth. So it is, freedom it comes with a judgmentalism. It judges you. If you don't know how to thrive in freedom, it means that you are at fault. You are, and the worst word you can use regarding blacks, you are inferior.
Now let's be fair to Shelby Steele. He does say he understands why an oppressed people would need time to adjust to freedom. This sounds reasonable enough. And yet, as a person who follows history, when I hear justifications like these, my ears perk right up. This is an argument which has existed for a long time, and one used to great effect in the justification of American colonialism. When the United States invaded Cuba and expelled the Spanish Empire in 1898, the ostensible aim was to free the Cubans so that they might rule themselves. But the U.S. was slow to hand over power to Cuba after the war. As President Theodore Roosevelt explained, "I am doing my best to persuade the Cubans that if only they will be good, they will be happy. I am seeking the very minimum of interference necessary to make them good." While plans were developing to transition Cuba to a manner of freedom amenable to the United States of America, taking special account for the concerns of predominantly white American businessmen, racist attitudes about the Cubans slowed the process. Leonard Wood, who served as Cuba's Governor General on behalf of the United States, exclaimed, "We are going ahead as fast as we can, but we are dealing with a race that has steadily been going down for hundreds of years, into which we have got to infuse new life, new principles, and new methods of doing things." Similar justifications pervaded America's long occupation of the Philippines in the early 1900s. Arriving at his post in Manila, American Governor William Howard Taft developed a view of Filipinos as too superstitious, ignorant, mendacious, and cruel for self-government. Whether the U.S. was in any position to say what ignorance and cruelty meant was an open question. American soldiers in the Philippines waterboarded, murdered, and tortured Filipino resistance fighters in a protracted war that left millions dead. But when freedom is defined by a strict adherence to culturally white values, you can imagine how difficult it is for people of other races to achieve such a freedom. With his belief in the ignorance and cruelty of the Filipinos guiding him, Taft actively worked against the Filipino independence movement. In 1907, he wrote, "I don't think anyone would accuse me of lacking sympathy with the Filipinos. No one is stronger than I in extending the civil service to the Filipinos as rapidly as they show themselves fit to fill their places. But there are a number of places that it is not safe in their own interest to trust the Filipinos." The Philippines did not gain independence until 1946, but the belief that certain races are culturally unprepared for the great responsibility of freedom has been used for more than just justifying colonialism. It was also used to justify slavery. In an 1856 letter, future Confederate General Robert E. Lee wrote, "I think slavery is a greater evil to the white man than to the black race, and while my feelings are strongly enlisted in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong with the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary in their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare them and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild, melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy." What Shelby Steele is asserting here comes from a long tradition of colonial thinking, which was used to maintain a powerful status quo and the disenfranchisement of a perceived weaker population. Steele wants the black community to ignore the material oppression which surrounds them every day in the name of a vague idea of freedom articulated by a society built on white supremacist ideas. The author James Baldwin knew this gaslighting technique well.
I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who's against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or on religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby has anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks I give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
What Baldwin feels he's being asked to do is to live up to an ideal which has never been demonstrated to him by the very people who expect him to live up to that ideal. And that is the real reason why black Americans have not been able to thrive in so-called freedom. Not because of some kind of cultural inferiority, but because the whole idea of freedom presented to them is a red herring. Nonetheless, it's a red herring Candace Owens is willing to cling to.
Or do we realize that society is not perfectible? People suck in every profession. It is no excuse to paint society with a broad brush. It is certainly no excuse to accept a Democrat narrative, okay, that black people are being disproportionately hunted down by police officers because of the color of their skin. You want to know the best way to avoid not being brutalized by a police officer is to limit the amount of encounters you need to have with them, especially when it comes to violent crimes, okay?
If you want to stop getting in trouble, stop acting up. A fit policy for parenting a small child, but a vestige of patrician colonialism when applied to race relations. But let's return to this earlier idea that black people cater to the lowest common denominator.
Not every black American is a criminal. Not every black American is committing crimes. But we are unique in that we are the only people that fight and scream and demand support and justice for the people in our community that are up to no good. You would be hard pressed to find, a Jewish person who has spent 5 stints in prison, who commits a crime and dies while committing a crime, and that the Jewish people champion and demand justice for.
Okay, so I hate to play the I know Jews card at this point, but I've had a lot of Jewish friends growing up, still do, and I've heard plenty of stereotypes about them, but frankly, this is not one of them. I have never heard this before. I honestly think that if footage of Jews being regularly murdered by cops were going viral on the internet, the Jewish community would be very upset, don't you? I think the Chinese community would be upset. I think Puerto Ricans would be upset. I think white people would be upset. But don't forget that the entire premise of the point Candace is trying to make here has absolutely nothing to do with what actually happened in the case of George Floyd.
You would be hard pressed to find, a Jewish person who has spent 5 stints in prison, who commits a crime and dies while committing a crime.
If that's supposed to be an analogy to the George Floyd situation, it's a misleading one. This would have been a fair analogy if George Floyd had been killed while committing some kind of violent crime. He wasn't. He was killed lying down and defenseless, while a police officer knelt on his neck for 9 minutes in broad daylight. Anything else about George Floyd, his background, his record, his character, has nothing to do with what happened to him. This "he was no angel" argument has been used many times to discredit black victims, but it's always a fallacious argument. Candace's misleading analogy pairs well with her misleading statistics. Let's take a look at this moment in the video.
And unfortunately, black community commits a disproportionate amount of crimes compared to the white community. Let me tell you, 6% of the population, right? Black men, 6% of the population account for 44% of all murders in this country, according to 2018 statistics. That is what you call a gap. And yet white people who represent 60% of the population, we represent 13, black men are 6%, only represent 50% of all the murders, right? That makes no sense. We commit 50% of all violent offenses, evenly split, and we're only 13% of the population, okay? So we have a lot more encounters with police officers. And don't say the police officers are coming around because we're black. I'm talking about violent criminals. I'm talking about murder. 44% of murders, okay?
Notice how she starts by saying black people account for a disproportionate amount of the murders in this country. Then, in her next breath, she seamlessly changes that to 6% of black men.
6% of the population, right? Black men.
Who she says account for 44% of murders compared to white people. That is, both men and women, who represent 60% of the population and commit 50% of the murders. See that little sleight of hand there?
And yet white people who represent 60% of the population, we represent 13, black men are 6%, only represent 50% of all the murders.
So now we are comparing one race's males. Males statistically commit a much larger share of violent crime across all racial classifications, with another race's males and females. So Candace has basically diluted her white statistics to manufacture what sounds like a staggering disparity between two races. Very tricky, Candace. And besides, I looked up that statistic, and it's actually 6% of black men account for 44% of murder arrests, not convictions. The last time I checked, America was an innocent until proven guilty country. The question this statistic actually raises is one Candace Owens doesn't want to ask. Why are black people disproportionately arrested for murders? That would be an interesting discussion to have, but it's not going to be had in Candace Owens' video. Instead, the statistic is just thrown out there in a misleading way to support an overall conclusion that black people are just, well, worse for some reason, but definitely not because of racism. The same could be said for Candace's 18.5 statistic.
On average, a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black person than the other way around.
This statistic was compiled by a woman named Heather McDonald, who, far from a dispassionate statistician, has been a regular on the right-wing talk show circuit. Here's how she manufactured this statistic. 36 unarmed black male victims of police shootings in 2015 was measured against the total population of black males to create a figure of 0.00, a bunch of zeros, 18. Once again, notice the narrow focus of the statistic. 36 unarmed and shot by the police. Expanding this statistic to include blacks killed other ways by police, as George Floyd was, that number balloons to 76. Also, armed suspects did not include suspects assumed to be armed, who turned out not to be armed, which balloons that number up to 295. But let's just stick with McDonald's 36 number just for funsies. By comparison, 52 law enforcement officers were feloniously killed out of 628,000 total. Without any data on how many black men killed cops in 2015, an historical average was used to show 40% of all cop killers were black men. So a ratio of 36 over 19 million is being compared with a ratio of 21 over 628,000. That's 19 million of every kind of African American male, old, young, even little babies, being compared with just 600,000 cops engaged in dangerous police work every day. When you compare such wildly disproportionate variables, you are bound to get wildly disproportionate figures like 18.5. Here, let's make our own statistic. So McDonald arrived at the 21 black cop killers figure by using historical averages for the last 10 years. Let's do the same. From 2006 to 2015, 289 of 542 men who killed a cop were white, or 53%. 53% of 52 is 27. So that's 27 white cop killers versus 628,000 cops, or 0.000042. Next, we take the figure for unarmed white men killed by cops in 2015, which is 45, and divide it by the total population of white males, which is 100 million. And that answer is 0.00000045. Finally, we divide the last figure into the first, and we get about 93. And there we have our lovely crap statistic.
Did you know that a cop is 93 times more likely to be killed by a white man than an unarmed white man is to be killed by a cop?
Scientific data can't be racist.
See? When it comes to manufacturing meaningless statistics, anyone armed with motivated reasoning and a calculator can do it. But that isn't the point. The point is for you to hear,
on average, a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black person than the other way around. Oh my God!
Now you might be asking yourself, why would a black woman propagate racist myths and misleading statistics to discredit her own community? It doesn't make sense. Well, I can't really say for sure what motivates an individual like Candace. What I do know is that the color of your skin does not automatically determine your opinion. This should not be a controversial statement among the I don't see color crowd. And if we are to judge a person not on the color of their skin, but the content of their character, as Martin Luther King called us to do, then we must judge Candace's opinion on its merits. And on its merits, Candace's opinion is wrong. We're not here to analyze what's inside Candace Owens' heart. We're only here to analyze what comes out of Candace Owens' mouth. So what is Candace Owens' goal in trying to discredit George Floyd's character? Her goal is to seize an opportunity to delegitimize the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole by casting a pall of doubt on a high-profile victim's character.
But why are we pretending that this criminal should be upheld as a citizen, as a martyr in Black America? A martyr for a fake narrative, by the way. Police brutality, racially motivated police brutality is a myth, okay?
Now, Candace Owens is careful to condemn the actions of Derek Chauvin, the officer who killed George Floyd.
Now, again, I want to be clear. This is not a defense for Derek Chauvin. No one that I have spoken to, no one in the news is defending Derek Chauvin. He is getting what he has coming to him. Okay, great.
But that is only because she knows that siding with the cop in this case is a totally indefensible position that even President Trump isn't willing to take. Overall, though, focusing on what kind of person George Floyd was misses the point. People aren't marching to prove something about the character of George Floyd. They are marching because George Floyd was unjustly killed, as Candace admits. And to a larger aim, they are marching for all those who have been unjustly beaten and killed by a police force which has not demonstrated a respect for Black lives. George Floyd's death was a spark. His victimization woke people up to a persistent problem that was boiling up for a long time. He was not the perfect spark, nor was he the perfect victim. But he happened to be the spark. Revolution is like love. It does not come at a perfect time or in a perfect way. But when it comes, you got a choice. Embrace or reject. Thanks everyone for tuning into this video. This was something I was inspired to do very last minute, and I put it together as quickly as I possibly could. Don't forget to like and subscribe this video and to donate to my Patreon channel. Anything you donate this month is going to go to Black Lives Matter. So that's really cool. I've actually had a few people in my friend group send me this video and ask me to comment on it and talk about it. And I've noticed that even a lot of people who I would identify as on the left or on the liberal side of things are being convinced by the arguments in this video. So I hope that this helps to debunk some of that. I'd also once again urge you to look in the description of this video, because I have posted a few videos from people of color actually talking about this, from African Americans talking about this video. So you can kind of, instead of getting this from a white boy like me, you can hear it from people who actually do experience the discrimination that this movement is fighting to end. So with that said, just hope you all stay safe and full of love, and never forget that Black Lives Matter.